We are at 2 minutes after and want to we value everyone's time, and this is, as you saw, being recorded. So if you want to go back, or for anyone that misses the first half, we can have a look later. So welcome everyone to another First Response Mental Health and Peer Connect webinar. We're very thankful to have Kathy Rolfe here to deliver today's presentation. Before I hand it over to her, just some of the usual housekeeping. We're going to save questions until the presentation is done, but please, as they come into your head, as you think of them, put them in the chat and we'll keep track of those and bring them up during the Q&A time. It was pretty nice last time. I know that the person that delivered the webinar asked for people to introduce themselves in the chat, who you are, where you're from, maybe your role as a first responder or a spouse of a first responder or a peer support coordinator or whatever you are and whatever you do. If you want to put that in the chat, that's always helpful to get the ball rolling as well. So we will get started. My name is Nick. I've been with First Response kind of since the beginning and been able to meet a lot of you, and excited to have Kathy do this presentation today. So I will read her bio and hand it over. Kathy Rolfe is a registered psychologist. She joined the military at the age of 17, spending her 18th birthday at boot camp. She remained in the military for 6.5 years while completing her criminology degree at the University of Alberta. Kathy was then recruited by the Edmonton Police Service as a signals officer at headquarters and signals at CFB Edmonton. She remained with the EPS Edmonton for 20 years and has a lived understanding of the military and first responder culture. While working at EPS, Kathy came to realize the significant need to support first responders and their mental health. She completed her Masters of Counselling in Counselling Psychology while working as a sergeant with the EPS. Kathy left the EPS in 2019 to work in the psychology field full-time. Kathy also has a listing as an authorized service provider on the Peer Connect platform. So thanks again to everyone. Looking forward to hearing the presentation and discussion. And Kathy, we will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Nick, and thank you all so much for coming today. And also thank you so much for inviting me here to share about families and first responders and trauma. It's such an important topic, and I get asked to present on it quite a bit, which I think just really speaks to kind of the importance and the fact that oftentimes people who are the family members of the first responders tend to kind of get forgotten. They tend to be sort of lost in the mix of it all. So it's nice to be able to actually put some time aside and chat specifically about the families today. So as Nick said, yes, I started in the military in 1993. The day after I graduated from high school, off I went to boot camp. And, it's funny because the drinking age in Alberta is 18. And so my niece, who turned 18 a couple of years ago, was sending pictures on our family chat about, oh, here I am on my birthday. So I actually sent her the picture of me sitting in a trench. That was my 18th birthday picture. A little bit different. And then ultimately I ended up having a couple of friends as I went through the criminology program who were interested in becoming a police officer. And so just as luck would have it, one of them was crazy enough to put me down as a reference. And in talking to recruiting for EPS, I ended up kind of striking up a conversation about what I was doing with myself, which at that time I was sort of having to make a decision about whether or not to stay in the military. And they sort of said, oh, why don't you come on down and throw a resume in? So, okay, sure. And then next thing you know, you're sort of jumping through the recruiting hoops. And 1999, I was successfully hired with the Edmonton Police Service, where I stayed for 20 years. So I left in 2019 and basically just had myself a wonderful time until it was kind of a bit much. I took a year off to register, but then actually ended up going back to EPS. So I was sort of doing both for a while, and ultimately just ended up saying, okay, I can't work 2 full-time jobs forever. So time to make a decision. So it was great to be able to kind of sidestep into this. And of course, naturally, my primary clients are first responders and military and veterans for obvious reasons. It's nice to have a lived understanding of the culture. So off we go. So we're going to talk about a little bit, just speaking of the culture, is exactly that, the police culture to start. I find that oftentimes, spouses it's a trial by fire kind of situation. They're married to first responders and they're sort of hearing the stories as they come home. Of course, with gatherings and that kind of thing, they sort of get to know some of their friends. And so you sort of get like a little bit of a lived understanding of what it's like. But in the same turn, sometimes it's nice to just kind of, talk a little bit about kind of sort of the expectations and what they go through, especially at the start of the job, and how things might change as things go on in their careers. But so then we're going to also talk about sort of what stress is, the risk factors, what trauma is, what is PTSD. Oftentimes people come home with these diagnoses, and certainly, the spouses know they're not well, but what exactly is the criteria to get diagnosed with PTSD? And of course, then going into how it affects families and how we can, take care of ourselves and how we can promote healing, both for ourselves, for our first responder spouse, as well as for our kids. So the first thing is you really find right off the bat, especially when you're new on the job, it's a very team environment. And so there tends to be kind of this triangulation that takes place almost immediately, sort of the demands of the job relative to, the push-pull, a bit of a tug-of-war between, well, you got to be part of the team, so you got to come out to all these squad functions. And sometimes, you're not allowed to bring your spouses. And there's road trips, or there's sort of the new guy jobs, that is part of the culture, especially when, I got on in 99. So, there was sort of like this, I had to be the new guy. So now you have to do all the new guy stuff, starting the cars, pouring the drinks. So, you're there early, and you're usually there late into the evening if you're working a shift where you're having a couple drinks after work. So almost right off the bat, there tends to be a little bit of a draw and a demand for your time, versus, of course, kind of your regular everyday life kind of things. So basically, you still have responsibilities at home, and, birthday parties for the kids, or vacations, or trying to maintain relationships, for instance, that are, people that aren't first responders, date nights with your spouse, that kind of thing. So lots going on as far as kind of trying to manage both demands. That tends to happen pretty quickly, especially when you're new and you really want to prove yourself. A lot of the time, that tends to be quite an uptick early in the career. And then perhaps as time goes on and you're a little more comfortable in your role, you're not feeling quite the amount of pressure, but especially at first, it's there for sure. So then, of course, as well, we have this real sort of what is the culture of the first responder world? Pretty quickly, you tend to kind of get exposed to some things that aren't very good sometimes. And so basically, it's sort of like, how do we, go as a first responder and go to these things, but also sort of separate ourselves emotionally from what we're seeing and how we might feel about stuff like that. So Wayfound out of Calgary, it's not their original idea, but they definitely talk a lot about it in the Before Occupational Stress program. This idea of the functional disconnection, where basically we have to be able to go to these calls and not feel all our feelings, because we probably wouldn't be very effective if that was the case. So essentially, you sort of learn how to compartmentalize. You sort of put the uniform on and turn the emotions off, that kind of thing. And it is a functional disconnection, because you have to disconnect in order to function. But there's also this sort of expectation of don't feel it, keep going, especially in the first responder world these days, it's call to call to call, especially if you're frontline. So it is sort of like, you go to one call and it might be pretty gnarly, but you know what, you got to keep going, you got to keep going. Lately, there seems to be a little bit more of an appreciation for having to kind of take what I know EMS calls like a brownout, where you can kind of take a minute. But for the most part, it's quite high paced, it's fast paced, and you got to just sort of put it in a box, keep going. And so that's really the culture. The wolf pack example, I kind of use this example sometimes about, when you're in the wolf pack, which might be your squad, and essentially you don't want to be the one that starts to lag behind, because in the wolf world, the sick and the weak and the injured, tend to kind of like trail off and sort of die in the woods by themselves, sort of thing. And there's always this fear that you're going to be viewed like that. And so, you know, if you don't do well at functionally disconnecting, if you feel a lot of feelings, or you're starting to notice that you're becoming injured, this is sort of the thing that comes up where it's like, oh, I don't want to be the weak link, which just perpetuates this culture. However, in the same turn, you're going through your day at work and you're really doing this like functional disconnection, but then you have to somehow figure out how to reconnect when you get home. Unfortunately, it's tough to do that because it is so functional. You tend to be efficient. You tend to be, you know, good at your job, handling things that come at you. And so sometimes you get really, really good at staying disconnected. And it's tough because the family members start to notice this sort of shutdown that goes on with their first responder spouses. So even when there's, you know, kids involved where they're not really super engaging with the kids emotionally as much, they might go through the motions, but they feel very disconnected. So what kind of stress actually can come with the job? I know that PTSD tends to get a lot of attention, but there's a whole bunch of other kinds of injuries that can happen through the work. So operational stress, for instance, that's the kind of stress that is people going to the calls, to the events, and seeing what goes on the street. So that's sort of the events like the homicides, the sexual assaults, the domestics. Organizational stress tends to be more of like what happens within the walls of the organization. And a lot of the time, things like, you know, internal affairs complaints, you know, colleague on colleague complaints, you know, conflict, that kind of thing. Even stuff like not getting along with supervisors or not getting certain placements that you'd hoped for, that kind of thing can really actually have an emotional toll on a person. Compassion fatigue, of course, is one as well. I mean, I know compassion fatigue on its face tends to be one of those, like, you know, you go to the calls and you feel bad about, you know, what you're seeing. But actually, sometimes compassion fatigue is a result of that functional disconnection where you actually don't feel anything. So basically, you're just so stressed out and burnt out that you actually kind of go more into a shutdown and you kind of just don't really care about anything. The moral injury, a lot of the time, that's more like, I often say that's the who does that injury. So, you know, if somebody goes and does something, you know, say it's a person on person where it's like, you know, somebody punches somebody in the face and you're like, well, who does that? So that's sort of the moral injury. I know one example that comes to mind is EMS, where they're working really hard on keeping this person alive. They're getting them to the hospital. You know, they kind of sort of get a pulse back and then they bring him to CER and like the doctor calls it right away. That was just one that came to mind where basically they're like, well, geez, you know, we tried really hard to get this person back. And then, you know, just kind of right off the bat, that's sort of, you know, over. So moral injury like that, where it's like, geez, you know, you just kind of start to feel like things are devalued and it kind of rubs up against our own moral compass. Vicarious trauma, of course, we hear about that, especially in spouses a lot, where, you know, they're coming home, they're telling stories. Storytelling is a really, really big thing with first responders. I do feel like it's a big part of our coping mechanisms. So essentially, whether it's your spouse or whether you're just sitting around having drinks with the squad after work, you know, if you've gone to something quite terrible, it's helpful to talk about it. But in the same turn, when it's unfiltered, or there's certain things about it that might trigger something for someone, then we're looking at a vicarious trauma situation. You didn't go yourself, but you're definitely impacted. And then the sanctuary harm piece. The definition of sanctuary harm is failure to prevent or protect a person from harm. Typically, sanctuary harm is like, you know, through the organization. You know, the message a lot of the time through these organizations tend to be, you know, we're family, we're brothers and sisters in blue, until something happens. And sometimes it really feels like you end up betrayed or abandoned. And oftentimes what it can do, sanctuary harm can make PTSD symptoms worse. So that's really sanctuary harm, when you feel like you should have been supported, and in fact, the opposite happened. So you really tend to kind of lose faith in the organization and the people within it. So oftentimes you kind of think, geez, you know, like two first responders go to the same call. How come one is super, super affected and the other person's wondering what's for lunch? So there's a lot of things that we're bringing into these situations because we're all humans first and we all have kind of a bucket. And so depending on how full your bucket is before you start going to these calls, you know, certainly the bucket is stress. And so if you have a lot of stress, your capacity is much less than if you say have not a lot of stress in your life or not a lot of things that we're going to talk about here as far as risk factor goes. So essentially, these are the things that might kind of set you up or predispose you for PTSD or some of the kind of stress injury. So the history of trauma, definitely beforehand, you know, it might actually just cause us to have, like I said, low tolerance. The other thing is, you know, personality types, you know, so certainly there's people out there that just are all up in their feelings and really, you know, tend to kind of lean into other people's feelings. And so if you're an incredibly empathetic person and you're going to these kind of calls all the time, certainly that's not going to be helpful. So, you know, as opposed to say someone who is much more disconnected and is kind of a little bit more into themselves, then it doesn't matter. How does it affect me? Previous mental health issues, again, when we think about capacity, certainly things like a history of depression, anxiety, what it does is it really impacts your worldview. You know, I mean, depression tends to kind of have like a more bleak kind of like outlook. So certainly when we're going into a job where we see a lot of bad things, you know, if you have things like, you know, a mood disorder beforehand, that's really gonna, you know, it's really gonna impact us. Things like life, you know, things fill up your bucket, sick dogs, sick kids, you know, bills, you had a fight with your spouse before you came to work, you know, all that kind of stuff. Like that definitely impacts our volume in the bucket. This one, you know, I talked a little bit about like before, sort of like how we kind of view things. And, you know, attributions really do matter. When we think about kind of what meaning people are putting on the events that they see. So for instance, one that just comes to mind again is I had an EMS member who did CPR on a person who looked a lot like his mom. And so naturally, you know, that's going to have an impact on him as opposed to say his partner who doesn't have that same kind of association. So certainly that kind of stuff around, you know, a person that goes to a PEDS call that has children, right? You know, that kind of thing. You know, it's just what kind of meaning you're putting on it matters. The guilt and shame and the, you know, could have done more, should have done more. What if I had seen this instead? Or what if I had caught that? You know, we can really spin in this. I kind of call that coulda, shoulda, woulda thinking, like the three ugly sisters. You know, they ruminate, they steal your time, they steal your joy, you know, and unfortunately, you know, sometimes there are things that maybe we could have done differently. Or really when we think about kind of a distorted view of how much control we have over situations, you know, and that's a lot of the time when we start to kind of deconstruct these guilt and shame kind of viewpoints. It's like, well, could you really have done more? Maybe not, you know? So again, sort of that marriage between attributions and the coulda, shoulda, woulda thinking. So there's this thing called the violation of the just world hypothesis, which basically means if we think about a just world hypothesis, it's like good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. And that's just how the world should be if things are right. And we learn really quick that actually in the first responder world, we go to a lot of things where bad things happen to good people. And especially if it's like a person on person, like someone offends against someone else, you know, say like his domestic violence and that kind of thing, where, you know, you really have a hard time starting to really kind of believe in kind of human nature, you know, and especially when we think about complex trauma, like that sort of cumulative trauma, we see that a lot in the complex trauma world because, you know, you just kind of, it wears away at your view of human nature, basically. And that's where we start getting these broad strokes kind of attributions of everyone is bad. can't trust anyone, that kind of stuff. So you get quite suspicious because all you see is people offending against other people. So when we think again about the sanctuary harm, we talked about that. Just really, there's a shooting. I know in the police world, we're the best at armchair quarterbacking. And, if something especially went really sideways, you tend to have an opinion about that. So, internal affairs investigations, a felt lack of support, that kind of thing can definitely impact trauma. And then the other part is like the over-identification of your role. So basically, whether it's a police officer, whether it's EMS, anywhere where especially there's shift work, where pretty quickly we start to notice that we're starting to lose contact with people, our non-shift worker civilian friends, where essentially all of a sudden the only person that's off on a Tuesday, Wednesday is your squad. So you're spending a lot of time with other first responders, and you tend to really adopt that identity. And so there's just not a lot of like balance. And so unfortunately, especially if something happens where there's like an internal affairs complaint, for instance, and then you start to find that people start to back away or you feel abandoned, that really does tend to kind of rub up against this whole, this is who I thought I was. And that's going to cause us to be at higher risk for a stress disorder. So as I talked about earlier, there's two different ways to actually develop PTSD. The first one is just a single incident. Essentially what happens, like I use the example of like, you're walking across the street and you get hit by a car. Single incident, definitely, you have certain feelings about it, right? Certainly you might have some helplessness feelings, a loss of control, something that overwhelms your ability to cope, but it's once. The other one is more of a death by 1,000 cuts. This is what we see way more in the first responder world, where basically, we could never really point at one thing in the bucket and say, this is what caused my trauma. It's more of just this accumulation of a whole bunch of things. Certainly there's ones that you can point at and be like, this filled up my bucket more than others. That's really where our trauma stuff comes in as far as how we organize trauma treatment with complex PTSD. But it really is more of a death by 1,000 cuts. And like I said, the presentation can be different in the sense that someone who, say, got hit by a car isn't going to start thinking that everyone in the world is bad, right? But in cases like complex PTSD, you start to see these broader strokes attributions around sort of their opinion of other people in the world. So when we talk about PTSD, as I said, sometimes, our spouses will come home and they'll say, oh, well, guess what? I have PTSD. And you're like, well, as a spouse, you're going to know what that looks like in your spouse, but you might not exactly know like how you end up with a diagnosis. So I thought I'd just quickly let you know, maybe through the lens of the spouse. So obviously, there's an awareness that something bad happened. That's number one. Something actually bad has to happen. And then the second one is the intrusions. And so these are things like, they're called intrusions because they intrude. You don't ask for them to come into your mind. It's just that you might be driving down the street and then all of a sudden your spouse says, oh, you know what, this is the intersection where I went to that fatal, for instance, right? Like they weren't thinking about it before then, but it just pops into their brain. Oftentimes too with nightmares, as the spouse, you'll find that, you're waking them up in the night because they're, basically, fighting somebody or yelling, that kind of thing. So, you can definitely tell that there's thoughts and memories there that they're not asking for them. Avoidance, of course, this is where you find a lot of the time where people don't want to go out in public. They really hate crowds. So, it's like, I feel like I'm in danger. I don't want to go to certain places where perhaps it'll invoke memories, for the criterion B. And so essentially, you find that there's just a lot more like, I don't want to go, I don't want to do that in your spouse. The next one is sort of the mood piece. So essentially you're just finding they're becoming either like very, very depressed or they're becoming very, very anxious. And so, yeah, basically like there's the mood piece. And then there's also the cognition piece. And like the cognitive fog, and I'm kind of laughing because I can't tell you how many times I've had people come in, again, like dealing with a lot of first responders and veterans who've seen a lot of stuff. So, they're coming and going like, I think I have dementia. I swear to God, I can't remember anything. I got lost coming here. I was supposed to pick something up at the grocery store, totally forgot. So, they tend to really become forgetful. And that can be worrisome. But then also, like I said, these attributions of, gosh, what, like, I really don't like people. I don't want to be around people. I don't trust anyone, that kind of thing. And then also, of course, the arousal and reactivity. So like I said, lots of anxiety, lots of hypervigilance, paranoia. You'll find even things like road rage becomes a thing. So these are all things that you notice as like a notable change in your spouse after the bad thing. So like I said, sometimes you'll be able to point at it. Other times it kind of wears away. But what you do know is that the person that started the first responder job is not the same person that you're married to now. The reason for this is because the reptilian brain and the limbic brain, when we think about PTSD, and I often say this to my clients, the last two letters are SD, stress disorder. You are a disorder, like, you have a stress disorder. So basically what that means is like the reptilian brain, which is all about fight or flight. They're constantly on guard for threat. And the limbic brain, which is like the feelings associated to that. So you have your fear response, and essentially those two types, or those two parts of the brain, completely cut out the neocortex, or that sort of frontal lobe, where it's like all of the logic and the memory, penchant for details, consequences, all that kind of stuff, that gets shorted right out. And so essentially you have your reptilian and limbic brain in this constant state of exchanging information about how everything is dangerous. And you have this part that could rationalize something different out of the equation, is left right out of the party. So I often say to my clients, like, if you think about being chased by a bear, you're not going to be counting the flowers and you're not going to be taking note of the colors. Essentially, you're just running for your life. And so, of course, you're not going to remember a lot of things like, here's the grocery list, can you please come and get this stuff, or where your car keys are, because this is what makes you super forgetful. These two pieces of your brain in a stress disordered world tends to kind of short all that out. So how do you communicate with someone who is dealing with this sort of shorted out logical brain, and who is kind of always in this fight or flight? This is where I have my clients start getting used to talking in numbers. So what I mean by that is, if you think about 0 to 10, where 0 to 3 is like hypoarousal. And I often kind of in my head imagine that as like total shutdown. It's like really big depression, lots of kind of just like laying around, kind of sea lion on a rock kind of thing, where they can't get engaged. They just can't, it's like sort of this emotional shutdown. And then say like 3 to 7 is I'm in a window of tolerance. My frontal lobe is actually online. We can have conversations, we can make plans, we can have some difficult conversations, perhaps even. And then we have like the 7 to 10, which is the hyperarousal, which is where you see a lot more of the activated symptoms. So you're seeing things like anger, anxiety, hypervigilance, paranoia, where again, you're being chased by the bear. You're really not in a place to be having kind of conversations around sort of like where you want to go for dinner or what the weekend plans are going to be, let alone something where there might be some kind of hot topics to talk about. So oftentimes, especially if there's conflict or potential conflict, check-ins with the spouse around what number are you at? Or as the spouse to say, you know what, I'm at an 8. I kind of just need to take a break. Can I come back when I'm just kind of back into this window of tolerance? So it really does become sort of this conversation where you're sort of throwing numbers at each other, especially if you're finding that you're falling out of the window of tolerance. So it's just a good way to kind of like connect with them on a level where you're sort of showing them that you understand, you know, how their process is going to be. So to the family. On a day-to-day level, what you're going to find is that because you have a person who's really not great at kind of planning, you're going to find that a lot of the time that stuff kind of falls to you, as well as things like, you know, again, the medications, the nightmares, the sleeplessness. I mean, we all know, you know, if you're not getting any sleep, how tough that can be on mood and, you know, our ability to kind of rationalize and cope with things. Exposure hangover is like, you'll find this a lot in treatment, but they'll go out in the world and come back and they're just exhausted. It is such a huge emotional and energy dump just to go and do the thing and then come back. So, you know, for instance, if you have a family event where it's like there's a bunch of people there, which again, when we think about like first responders and their hypervigilance, it's a lot of sensory input. So it's loud, there's a lot going on, people are running behind them, and their hypervigilance is like massively keyed up. So basically they get home and they just collapse. Like, and that's where you'll find they go into that hypoarousal of just like, oh my God, like exhausted. But that might last for a day or two. That might last for a few days. And so, you know, to kind of like try and get them to engage again or go do something again becomes very difficult. Again, we talked about the memory issue. So things like make sure you put stuff on calendars, make sure you write stuff down, lists are helpful, that kind of thing. And then of course, like, you know, because all the world is bad, sometimes you're going to find that especially parents, they become very overprotective of the kids. Like, no, you can't go to that sleepover, or I need to know all the information. And if you don't have it, then you can't go, that kind of thing. Medication becomes an issue. You know, I call it the medication merry-go-round. That's not an actual technical term, but it's like, try this one. Oh, it didn't work. Okay, wean off that. Get back on this one. How's that one? Oh, that one makes you sick. That one makes you nauseous. That one makes you tired. So, I mean, it's just this constant state of kind of trying to deal with emotions and potentially medication and therapists and all of this stuff. And then sometimes they might actually get sick and tired of it. Nobody wants to be on meds. And so it might be one of those things where they're like, never mind all of it, I'm going off of a med. And then what could happen is they could potentially really end up in the emergency room because you can't just quit taking meds. A lot of the time there's a ladder down, but they don't know that, right? And they're not thinking clearly. So, you know, it's just, it's a lot to have to kind of take on, right? The other thing about, and nobody likes to talk about it, but I hear about it a lot in sessions, is the neuroreceptors that help with depression and anxiety are the same ones that actually help a person get an erection. And so unfortunately, when it comes to the sex life, there's kind of no vacancy at the inn when it comes to trying to like actually get the neuroreceptors to do something other than be depressed. Let's just put it that way. And of course, that's going to actually weigh heavy on not only the first responder, if it's male, that tends to really be very, very emasculating. And as the spouse, it's like, oh, you know, like, maybe I'm not attractive, you know, so it can really kind of bring with it a bunch of shame kind of on both ends. So, you know, good communication is just so, so, so important. And then finally, what you find is, again, because of that avoidance, you know, you do a lot of stuff alone as a spouse. You know, you go to those parties by yourself. I often joke that if I wanted to write a book on PTSD, I would call it So You Want to Go Grocery Shopping, because there have been more abandoned grocery carts and, you know, people running for the door in these large kind of warehouse, you know, Home Depots and Costco's and things than I can count. Like, basically, it's just something triggers them and they're running for the door. And, you know, so of course that's going to happen a couple of times. And they're like, no, thank you. I'm not going to do that again. It's embarrassing, right? And so as the spouse, you tend to kind of have to pick up a lot of the responsibilities around that stuff. again, when we think about like the way that PTSD can show up, of course, certainly, you know, we have like the stress, right? There's a lot of stress. And so, of course, when you don't have a lot of capacity, you know, there might be things like poor coping skills, you know, trying to numb out, right? Like, you know, addiction issues, alcohol, weed a lot of the time, that kind of thing. But then there's also like a much higher potential for intimate partner violence. And so, you know, really it's tough because, you know, as a spouse of someone who's struggling, when you're finding that the anger is getting triggered a lot, you know, things in the house gain wings and start getting thrown across the room, like that's violence too, right? And so, like, you know, my message is always very much that, you know, if you're in danger, like you can support from a distance, but certainly you don't have to stay in that relationship. The thing is with that though, you know, certainly it comes with a lot of guilt and shame because we start contemplating that stuff. Oh, you know, what does it say about me if I leave this person? I feel unsafe, but they're not okay. So there's this real sort of push-pull between sort of your own like morals, I guess, as a spouse, but then also safety issues that come with staying. And so that's always something where, you know, creating safety plans is really important. Because certainly, you know, we want to make sure more than anything that.
What do you mean? What do you mean by that? What do you mean they were weird?
I'm sorry? Hello? Oh, okay.
I think just go ahead, Kathy. Someone's mic might have been off.
Okay. And then, you know, Gil Martin's book, The Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement, you know, he writes a lot about the shrieking circle of asshole. And I love that term so much only because, you know, essentially, like when you first start out on the job, everyone's out to help. But then, of course, all of a sudden we go, you know, we go like, well, if they're not a first responder, then they can't be trusted. And then if they're not in my division, they can't be trusted. And then if they're not in my squad, they can't be trusted. And then if they're not my partner, they can't be trusted. And so this circle of trust tends to kind of like shrink and shrink to a point where essentially all of a sudden it's like, well, I think I'm the only one that I can only trust myself because I can't trust anybody else, right? So, you know, certainly in that regard, you know, it kind of becomes like a little bit of a funny thing. It's almost like the longer you get on the job, the less you trust people. And then also, like I talked about before, when we talk about like shift work and that kind of thing, you know, you definitely also have like the used to, right? What did you used to do? Because you can't make shinny hockey every Wednesday night anymore. And so basically, you know, you kind of start having these like friend groups that fall off. And you really tend to kind of like try and figure out like, you know, like who am I now, right? Because you're getting all of these changes, you know, from the PTSD diagnosis, but also, you know, you're kind of over identifying in that role of the first responder. So we kind of end up in this kind of existential role identity crisis. So the other thing is, of course, as the spouse, all of a sudden this spouse comes home and says, okay, so I have PTSD. And it's like, okay, what, like, you know, unfortunately, it tends to kind of fall on the spouse a lot of the time to be the day-to-day in taking care of their spouse, especially when they go off. And so it's sort of like, okay, well, how do I help this person? I don't have an education in trauma. Like, I mean, all of a sudden they're moody or they're sleeping all day or they're drinking a lot. What does that mean, right? And so, you know, certainly in that regard, there's a lot of kind of feelings of like, oh my gosh, like, I don't know how to help. But then there's also this kind of like, you know, why us, why our family, why my spouse, right? You know, and so sometimes you just kind of feel like quite angry at the whole situation. Especially because you can't really be angry at your spouse. I mean, they didn't do anything, right? You know, they went to a couple of pretty gnarly calls and ended up injured. And so, you know, just like you wouldn't be angry at a person for breaking their leg, you certainly can't be angry at them for developing a stress disorder. But you know, it's hard. It's just hard. Caregiver burnout, of course, like we talked about, you'll be picking up a lot of the slack. And so a lot of things around like, you know, you know, having to kind of take kids to soccer games and that kind of thing, or sporting events, because, you know, the spouse doesn't want to go. They just literally can't sit in the stands and watch a football game anymore. So you do tend to kind of like become kind of the primary caregiver, not only to the kids, but also to your spouse at times. And then also the other thing is, if they're off, you know, there might be a pay cut. So you might have to actually work more, right? So there's a lot there as far as burnout goes. And of course, that also means that your own self-care as a spouse goes down because you're just, you know, you're running all the time, run. Again, we talk about the shame. What does it say about me if I leave? Because again, you know, they do at times, you end up feeling quite trapped, but in the same turn, you know, all of the attention needs to kind of be paid to the first responder spouse. But, you know, what about me as the spouse? I need to be taken care of too, right? The kids do as well. So it's like a real push-pull emotionally sometimes. Speaking of kids, you know, there's a lot of things around the kids, you know, I mean, especially when you think about kids and their journey as the child of a first responder. I know I used to work in schools, like when I was doing my provisional time, and there was one kid there that was kind of struggling, and I'll never forget him, but the first thing that the teacher said was, both that kid's parents are cops. And I thought, isn't that interesting? You know, like there's this sort of like expectation that, you know, they're sort of held to a higher standard. As well as, you know, things like video games, media, you know, kids on the playground. You know, I know that one kiddo came to visit me one day and said, oh, you know, like some, you know, child on the playground came up to him and said, well, I mean, all the cops get shot in my video games, so your dad's going to get shot, you know, and it's like, they're children, they don't know. But in the same turn, this is the stuff they're kind of putting up with, right? Again, you know, you're the child of a first responder, so, you know, there's this higher standard that you're being held to. They internalize that. So it's like, well, maybe I do need to be a better kid. The other thing about kids is that they tend to be very like egocentric, right? Like it's sort of like, you know, you hear this a lot when, you know, things are happening. Like, you know, if I'd only scored that extra game in soccer, my kids wouldn't get divorced, or my parents wouldn't get divorced, or like, you know, they have this sort of like distorted view of their control in the world. And so, you know, when you talk about things like, you know, if I'm a better kid, dad won't be depressed, you know, like that kind of thing. So there's that real sort of like, they take on a lot as kids. Interestingly, and I think it's because we're sort of a product of what we're exposed to, but especially if there's like higher conflict in the home, you know, they're going to mirror that, you know. So basically, you know, if we have angry PTSD person at home, you know, they'll be mirroring that on the playground. Or because you have a parent that's in like a lot of shutdown, they'll be seeking out that emotional support elsewhere. So they become very, very clingy with like teachers or friends. Some of the older kids, you know, because they see their parents struggling, and they're also watching the support system spouse struggling, because it's just go, 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 go. Oftentimes the older kids will actually adopt kind of a surrogate parent role when it comes to maybe having to like take care of the other kids in the house. So, you know, sometimes these kids grow up pretty fast. So with all that, what do we do? First thing is, as we talked about, unfortunately, the self-care tends to be the first thing to go. I think really, even as a rule, generally, when people are busy, the self-care is the first thing to go. So, you know, we got to be able to put that stress and anxiety as a spouse like somewhere. So, you know, punching bags, exercise, lift heavy weights, run. You know, a lot of the time, your own trauma, your own stress, your own anxiety, it's a very physical emotion, right? So, you know, if you can do stuff to get it out, have an outlet. Social buffering basically says that it doesn't even matter if you're talking about your problems, if you're with someone who loves you, right, who you know is a support, that makes it better, you know. So, I mean, you can almost sit in silence sometimes, but, you know, at least you have someone that you know that you can, you know, sit with or talk to. And then of course, also just making sure that when we're so overloaded as a spouse, that we're also making sure we get a little bit of that balance in our life. Make sure that you can also do some self-care stuff like friends, wine dates, dinners. Okay, so we talked about the functional disconnection. And so basically the opposite to the functional disconnection is the functional reconnection. And so essentially it's sort of like taking the cop hat or the first responder hat off and putting on the, you know, the spouse outfit, you know, or the parent outfit instead, you know. And oftentimes I encourage people to do that even at their locker, where it's like, you know, when you're shedding your uniform and you're putting on your work clothes, can we make that a purposeful, mindful event where it's like, I'm going to leave work here and I'm going to try and be, you know, as present as I can with the kids, that kind of thing. So, you know, if you can encourage that in your spouse, that's great, you know, definitely. Therapy, obviously, you know, if you can get it early. And I often say, like, you know, I would love to see like therapy having to be a thing as in recruit class, but also as the spouse. Again, it's another place to put some of the things that you're feeling. And really, it can be an oil change, like, you know, psychologists, even once a month, check in. Sometimes you can talk about paint drying. Other times you can talk about some of the crazy stuff that's happened at home. But either way, you have that ear that's walking with you through this. Settling the system. So again, when we think about our nervous system, when it comes to that anxiety and feeling of overload and overwhelm that can come as a spouse, essentially it's like, okay, we need to actually take a minute and try and get ourselves back into our own window of tolerance, right? You know, where we're not just either laid right out or we're, you know, running constantly on stress and anxiety. So, you know, doing some mindfulness, daily practice, you know, yoga, you know, our body is a beautiful thing where our muscle memory, we can actually remember, our muscles will remember what it's like to be relaxed. So it's like, okay, you know, I need to kind of take some breaths and try and kind of shake that out. Anxiety is very future focused, right? And so essentially, if we can also be as present as possible, that really helps. You know, again, that mindful practice of, you know, I'm going to go outside, I'm going to feel the sun on my skin, I'm going to listen to the birds, and we just hit pause. Just be right here. Because I think in a world where everything is very, very quick, everything is running, always running, you know, it's like, can we be present? And sometimes that can be 10 seconds, that can be 30 seconds. It doesn't have to be half an hour of yoga practice, right? It can literally be micro moments or glimmers, as we're hearing these days. Watching our own self-talk, right? You know, when we talk about like, you know, the, you know, just what's your fault and what's not your fault, right? You know, and I think sometimes too, especially when we have a person with a stress disorder and their world is very much like distorted, right? It's everyone's evil, you know, sometimes that even includes you as a spouse. You know, just make sure that you're like really kind of trying to challenge that negative self-talk that might come with, you know, even just living with a person that sees the world in a mostly negative way. I mean, that's one of the criteria, right? And so it's sort of like, you're not a bad spouse, you're not a bad parent, you know, you're doing the best you can, and just really do your best to watch that. Get some rest, go, right? Talk to someone, doesn't even matter, you know, who, doesn't have to be a therapist. Like I said, could be a bestie, could be, you know, whoever. And then ultimately build a community. You know, like I co-facilitated with Wounded Warriors once, and I loved it on the very first day, because what they did is they actually took the spouses and they actually put the spouses together, and they took the veterans, and they actually had the veterans go off and do some exercises. It was camp praxis, so they were working with the horses. And, you know, really when you got the spouses together, you said, you know what, you don't know one another, but you know each other very, very well, because your story is going to be very similar. So if you can find, you know, that community, a support group, just anything you can where there's like an understanding of what you're going through. It's so helpful. I know the Edmonton Police has a spouses association. Stuff like that is just awesome, you know? So yeah, it's good stuff. Okay, so guarding yourself around vicarious and secondary trauma. For me, I was always like, when my first responder spouse would come home, I would say, I don't want to hear about kids. I don't want to hear about animals. Anything else is on the table, but that's just I don't want to hear about that stuff. And it's okay to set those boundaries. So what you can do is you can say instead, like, how was your day? What do you need? Like, you know, they can still come home and say that, you know, it wasn't a good day. It just wasn't a good day. And it's like, okay, you know what, I can attend to you without hearing the story, you know? So just setting your own boundaries is really important. You know, we want to be there for our spouse, but that doesn't mean we have to risk ourselves getting injured. Okay, so this one is like, you know, again, when they're first walking in the door, right? And maybe you'll even be able to tell that they need a hot minute. But, you know, kind of coming at them at first with like, you know, they haven't even put their bag down and it's like, kids, you know, plumbing, got to rush off, do this, you know, whatever the issue might be that day, your own crisis, right? Maybe give them 5 minutes, you know, and as a couple, you can kind of like decide how long that'll be. You know, 20 minutes, half an hour. I tend to kind of like discourage any longer than that, because then what we find is that they're just in the basement, isolating, not talking, but also kind of like from an us against the problem, you know, being perhaps a stress disorder where it's like, I know that you need some time to decompress, but how will I know when you're ready to talk? Like, you know, can we set a timeline, 20 minutes, I'll come down, check on you, you know, you want to come upstairs now, like that kind of thing. So again, you know, we can be on their team, right? And that's the most important thing is, you know, again, we understand, you know, that maybe you need a little bit of time. How am I going to know? Yeah, so basically, again, you know, as part of the functional reconnection, you know, it would be great if you can be there for them. Again, if you want to debrief a tough day, that's okay. But, you know, again, it's sort of like, if you need to do a little bit of a process to functionally reconnect, that's cool. But we also want to make sure that you're not just hanging out in the basement, not talking to anybody all night. So, the pursue withdrawal pattern, this is very like emotion focused therapy, but essentially it's like, you know, if you have a person who's in like real shutdown, and I'm just going to speak generally and almost stereotypically here, but a lot of the time the males tend to be the shutdown person and the pursuer is kind of the anxious, like we need to talk about this right now. And so basically the shutdown person gets like overwhelmed, and then they just start chasing them around, like the pursuer chases the withdrawer around the house, you know, like we need to talk about this right now. And they're going, I don't have capacity. So again, just kind of recognizing, you know, that, you know, if you have a person who's a withdrawer, a lot of the time too, they tend to be process driven. So, you know, they just need to think about it, right? But the pursuer who gets kind of anxious and wants to resolve things right away needs to understand that the withdrawer needs time. The withdrawer, however, also needs to commit to eventually coming back to it. You can't just like leave the pursuer hanging. So it's like, you know, I give you 20 minutes, give me an hour, and we can absolutely have this conversation. Okay, when we talk about the bad days, you know, again, even if it's stuff that, you know, like isn't the stuff we put the boundaries about, but say it's something that's kind of yucky. Oftentimes it's helpful to try and separate kind of like what they're telling you. So oftentimes I say like, you know what, you don't get traumatized when you watch stuff on TV or on a movie theater screen. So like, let's do that. Like in our head, when they're telling you that stuff, can we somehow actually kind of create a little bit of distance where we imagine it's actually a movie, right? And so it's sort of like a separation, but then I know also the feedback sometimes when I talk about this is, yeah, but that's my spouse. And it's like, yes, it is. And they can kind of also be in the movie, but we also know that they're sitting in your kitchen now, right? So they're okay, right? But in the same turn, it's like, just so that we don't take that on in our heart, sometimes it's easier to kind of like try and figure out how to separate that a bit by sort of giving yourself a bit of actual kind of like in our head distance from it. Okay. Communication, of course, you know, open, non-judgmental. I mean, I think that's kind of doesn't have to be a PTSD situation. That's just good advice anyway for couples communication. You know, dynamics, the triangulation, like we talked about, you know, as long as we can just create a safe place, you know, in order for them to feel like they can talk, but then also, you know, that needs to be reciprocated on their side. So yeah, again, I talked about that. You know, what do you need right now? What do you need? We can't solve the problem for them. We can't go back in time, but we can certainly try and attend to their needs then. So obviously the first one, take time for you. We talked about that. I think the other thing is, and I say this a lot to my clients, is, you know, it takes years to get to a place sometimes where we're dealing with a PTSD or some kind of occupational stress injury. We're not going to fix it overnight. And I can also tell you truly that it is never linear. Healing is never linear. So we're going to have some good, and then we're going to have a setback, and then we're going to have some good, and then we're going to have a setback. And so, like, let's just remember where we started and know that we're trending upwards. So, you know, I think a lot of the time it's tough because you see them improving, and then all of a sudden they just have a really bad day, and everybody kind of freaks out and goes like, oh man, you know what, I thought we were better, but I guess we're not better, and we get catastrophic in it. It's like, okay, this is recovery from a stress disorder. We're going to have our ups and downs. So let's just ground in the fact that yes, it's going to take time. It's not getting fixed overnight, and setbacks are normal and they're okay. Unnecessary demands, again, setting realistic expectations. We can't expect him to be going, and I always say him because it's basically like primarily a male profession. I was a first responder. I understand there's females in these jobs. But anyway, so I apologize. I'm gendering it, but I don't mean to. So basically, yeah, you know, I mean, like if we want to go to a concert, we're probably bringing somebody else. Healthy habits. So, you know, basically like what happens a lot is you take these first responders who are like structured, be here, be there, you know, like you really have to kind of like wear this, your break is then, you know, like that kind of stuff. And they go from that to being off. And so they have no structure and no routine. And so, you know, that can really also be a struggle. You know, typically I tend to give my first responders like a couple of weeks where it's like, get some rest, do you just process the fact that you're off, but then we got to set a routine. And even if that routine is, I get up with my spouse in the morning, I make them breakfast, I see them off to work, I do some yoga, grounding, go for a run, exercise, whatever. Even if you have half a day of routine, it is better than nothing. And so, you know, it might even seem kind of shallow, like, okay, I have to schedule in a coffee. Yes, you do. Yes, please do. Because it's at least something that's going to get you out of bed. Also, it's very easy, especially when you're living with someone with depression and anxiety, where they tend to kind of live in the negative. It's hard sometimes to see the positives because that stuff can be quite contagious. So, you know, let's celebrate the wins. You know what? If they went to Costco with you and they didn't freak out and run for the car, that's a good thing, right? So, you know, let's actually celebrate the wins together. That's actually really big. And when you have someone with this inner critic who's saying like, I'm broken, I am sick, what does this say about me that I have this disorder? When we're actually purposefully pointing out the wins, it's huge. It's just huge for them, right? So, I mean, it might seem simple, but it really does matter. So yeah, basically, especially when they get on medication, this is what I was kind of thinking about when I wrote this. You might see a physical presentation first when it comes to improvement. So like, you know, say you have a person who just started an antidepressant, they might be getting more sleep. They might actually be hungry again. You know, they might be less shaky. So, I mean, you might actually notice before their mood improves that there's actually some physical improvements first, which is just, again, just kind of something to keep in mind. And then, yeah, basically, when we again have somebody who is really down on themselves because now they're off work or they're struggling with this, again, connection is everything. So just letting them know that they matter, that they have value, and that basically people want to spend time with them, even when we've had some ruptures, right? Because the guilt and shame that tends to come after the rupture at times can really cause them to feel, that they're, feel bad about themselves. Sorry, I am going a little over. Okay, keep communicating. Read this book, it's amazing. The Gil Martin, when we talk about things like the emotional survival for law enforcement, he talks about the magic chair, where somebody's like, they come home from work, they've made decisions all day, they're going 100 miles an hour, and then basically it's like, I don't want to make a decision anymore. I want to sit in my magic chair and scroll on my phone. Team up, us against the problem. How can I help you? How can I support you? I'm here for you, especially when it comes to things like the sanctuary harm, interpersonal betrayal piece, letting them know that you're on their side. Yeah, take care of yourself. And, even if they say no, like drag them out, you gotta, because they'll be happy to stay home and avoid everything. And then again, basically, do your best to be gentle with yourself as well. Sometimes their stuff will become your stuff. Grounding, like we talked about, also very helpful just to try and get our own nervous system down. Yeah, everybody reacts differently to stress. Some people shut down, some people get incredibly anxious. So even within a family, if kids are dealing with it differently than the adults are, that kind of thing, just compassion, land on compassion. Community support, like we talked about. Here's a whole list of them. EPS Wives Clubs I talked about. Al-Anon, OSI Can, Wounded Warriors has COPE, Couples Overcoming PTSD Every Day, Can Praxis support groups, and do your best to really kind of like, find support. I know sometimes it's easier to not talk to the kids about the hard things, but again, just remembering that they really take stuff on. And so with that, like talking to them, meet kids at that level, but also like, being quiet about it isn't the answer either. We are not Academy Award winning actors. And so like, they're going to even just understand energy. So if, somebody's really depressed or angry, let's make sure that they're actually, they're being kept in the loop on some way. So age appropriate, but honest, again, because they take everything on, it's not your fault. You don't have to fix the parent. You don't have to be the parent, right? And then of course, like, if something happens, sometimes, like I said, like we don't have a lot of capacity for stress. So if there's a rupture, it's a really, really good opportunity to model how we can repair, how we can actually say, what, I'm sorry. This was maybe an imperfect, everybody is, I'll take responsibility, that kind of thing. Everything's just such a great opportunity when it comes to kids. Also, when you're about to lose it, tag out. That's the us against the problem piece with spouses and kids, right? Like, it's like, hey, I gotta tag out or I'm gonna lose it. And then know your own capacity. This is really more for the member that's struggling with trauma, but also of course, like, when a parent is running. And then finally, do your best to kind of like educate the kids as best you can within their capacity to understand, what trauma is. This is an important slide. Basically what we talk about is how you conceptualize the trauma, as far as like, it doesn't have to be a personal attribution to your spouse. So like, instead of getting bitter and resentful at the spouse, it can be very much like, this is separate. This is a symptom. This is PTSD. This is not a character attribution or who my spouse is as a human being. So sometimes it really helps. I oftentimes have my clients name their PTSD. So my example is that, I have this female first responder who named hers Helen. Like when Helen's in the room, she's the worst roommate ever, right? Like, man, she's messy and she's angry and she yells all the time. And so I'm like, well, why'd you name her Helen? And she says, because there's hell in the name. You know, so basically it's something where it's like from a how we view our spouse lens, how we view the illness. And then the other thing is we can also kind of create rules of engagement around that part. So it's like when Helen shows up, we're leaving, we're all agreeing to this. Or, you know, when Helen shows up, Helen knows that she's going to get kind of left alone or not engaged with. So these are things we can talk about. Treatment approaches, self-compassion, of course. All of these really just talk about how you can kind of like communicate well, try and meet people where they're at. Really more than anything, again, creating that safe place. Also making sure though that you don't get steamrolled, like you are allowed to set boundaries. And then basically, yeah, you know, essentially, this is a kintsugi vase. It talks a lot about, you know, the kintsugi vase is about how, you know, where there's cracks, they're filled with gold, and essentially they're stronger where the cracks are. And I love that. I love that so much because it's beautiful and it's, you know, cracked, but it's also strong. And I actually had one of my clients put together a kintsugi vase. She actually brought it from work, so it was also very symbolic for her. Smashed it, put it back together. And I love this picture. It's not of hers, but there was actually like a hole in it because, you know, you can't put it together entirely perfectly. But I said, oh, you know, you got a crack in it. And she said, that's where you let the light in. And I just really thought that was a beautiful way to look at it, because it's like, even in the tough times, there's always space to let the light in. So that's it. I'm sorry I went a bit over. Anyway, so I'm sure there's questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Kathy. Lots of good feedback. I don't know, Kate, if you've seen any questions. There's definitely a lot of clapping.
I think one just came in there, Nick.
Okay. So we have a question. First of all, a compliment, Kathy. This is amazing. How do you repair yourself while wanting to stay in EMS or stay in the job? Is quitting the first option?
Oh, no, not at all. You know, quitting, I mean, we have to first of all be honest with ourselves for sure. You know, the second thing is like, you know, I'd highly recommend, like, if you need some time, take the time and, you know, take it early, you know, like, you know, if you need to take some time, even intermittently through your career, I think like it's just so important, because oftentimes, like I say to my people, like, you know, if you take a month off now and just do some good directive therapy, you know, you're 6 years into a 30-year career. This is a drop in the bucket. So like, you know, if you need to do that a few times over your career, let's do that versus leave, you know. The other thing is, again, like being aware. I mean, therapy, as I said, and developing a real awareness of like, how are we thinking about what we're seeing? You know, are we taking on more than we should? But then also make sure you're talking about it. Like I said, self-care. But then also just checking in with our own nervous system, you know, really, you know, making sure that, you know, if we're finding like we're really having trouble, you know, let's actually up that self-care, get into some more of that kind of like, you know, I say it's a stress disorder, which means that we're oftentimes like very activated. So let's work on our body, you know, like let's really kind of work on our body, make sure we develop that capacity.
Great, thank you. We have some follow-up things that we'll do as well, because I know some people will have to leave as we're past the top of the hour. There was another one. Can you go back on your screen to the vase or vase, depending on your pronunciation? What was that called again?
Boss?
No, not the before uppermost, the broken jar.
Oh, the kintsugi vase. Yeah. Let's see if I can find that. Previous. Oh, went the other way. Previous and previous and previous. There it is. Kintsugi.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah.
I also had a question. Do you know what are any similarities or differences between PTSD and PTSI?
Well, I think like Can it be interchangeable? You know, I often say like anything that is like a injury or like a disorder is always on the far end of the spectrum, right? So basically, like whether it's a post-traumatic stress disorder or whether it's an injury, right? And so oftentimes it's like we find that as we're developing that criteria to get the assessment or like the diagnosis, sorry. So we're looking at that. Sometimes they might not meet all the criteria, you know, from A to E or whatever it was. So you might have a post-traumatic injury. Oftentimes too, though, we have that 30-day waiting period, right? So we kind of have that acute stress time period of 30 days where it might be like considered like a post-traumatic stress injury, but it hasn't met all that criteria to actually have it considered a disorder. Because, you know, everything kind of is on a spectrum when it comes to these stress injuries. So the disorder is one end of the spectrum. I hope that helped.
Thank you. Okay, yeah, great feedback. For those that were asking, copies of the presentation will be made to those that signed up or attended. We'll talk about, obviously these slides are Kathy's, so for now, don't share them beyond just yourself, and then we'll give some additional guidance and follow up as to how you can share them or have Kathy deliver this presentation to your group, whether that's a spouse group at your organization or your peer supporters or just your general membership. That is also an option. So we'll have Kathy's contact info in the follow-up email that comes along with this. As always, if you have questions for Kathy, you can contact her directly or go through us. If you have questions about the Peer Connect system and how it can kind of help you with providing some of these resources and managing some of your peer support and even spousal support teams. I know some of our groups do have separate spouse groups that are equipped using Peer Connect. So if you have any of those questions, get a hold of us. We're thankful, very thankful, Kathy. That was a great presentation. A lot of positive feedback there. And stay tuned for our next webinar. I don't believe we have a time yet, but we hope to keep these going for you. This was our most registrants and I think most participants that we've had yet. So it keeps growing and this was really great. So thank you, everyone. We will stop the recording now and look for that follow-up email in a few days with the additional information.